Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, Prosperity, Sustainability, and the Measurement of Wealth, presented by Kevin Mumford. My name is Greg Olston. I'm here with Ivy Exec, and I'm going to be helping to moderate the session today. So I'd now like to take this opportunity to introduce our presenter. Kevin J. Mumford is an associate professor of economics at Purdue University. He earned a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 2007. Professor Mumford teaches courses in labor economics, public economics, managerial economics, and econometrics at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. His research has focused on taxation, labor supply, poverty, fertility, and the role of human capital in measuring national wealth. He has published research articles in many journals, including the American Economic Review, the Review of Economic and Statistics, the National Tax Journal, the Environment and Development Economics Journal, and the Journal of Econometrics. So with that, I'm going to now hand the presentation over to Kevin.
Thanks, Greg. All right, well, I'll get started. Like Greg said, this is about sustainability and wealth. I'll start by talking about prosperity and how economists think about prosperity. So, I'm sorry, if the camera comes in and out, that's my webcam here. The idea of prosperity is, for economists, GDP is the most important statistical measure of prosperity. That's how we measure how countries are doing, how societies are doing. And GDP just measures all of the societies or all the countries' expenditure on all newly produced goods and services. And that's approximately the same thing as the income of every member of the society. So we haven't always had GDP as a measure. It was developed during the Great Depression by a whole team of economists, two of whom are quite well known, won the Nobel Prize, Kuznets and Stone. And it was adopted widely, and some of this was because the United Nations wrote a handbook and said, this is how you compute GDP, and started pushing it out to all the member countries. And now, if you go to any little country and go visit their statistics office, they have that national income accounting handbook sitting on the shelf, and it's updated from year to year. And basically, all the countries in the world all compute GDP in about the same way. And so it's a nice way to compare across countries, and it's a really nice way to compare across time to see how you're doing. So this is just sort of a quick summary chart of GDP measures per capita in constant US dollars across various countries. And so you can see, during the Great Recession in the United States, you can see a little dip. You can see some slow recovery after that. It's a good measure to see how are we doing. I should point out that at any point in this, if you want to write in with your questions, I'm happy to take interruptions as we go. And so Greg can handle those. All right, so there's some criticisms of GDP as a measure of prosperity. One of those criticisms is it has nothing to do with inequality. And so you could have a country in which you have everybody earning about the same income versus a country where you have a few very rich people earning a lot of income and a few people earning very little income, and they may end up having the same per capita GDP, and yet we would think of those societies as very different and maybe having different levels of prosperity. And GDP doesn't measure that. I'm not really going to talk very much about inequality today because what I'm proposing also has nothing to do with inequality as of now. At least we haven't moved that direction. The other two criticisms maybe I'll talk more about. And the first is that people criticize GDP as a measure of prosperity because it doesn't include things like quality of life. Like, the things that matter to people are family and friends and having meaningful work and a bunch of things like this. And that's not GDP, the critics will say. And my response to that is something like, well, GDP is not directly measuring any of those things. But yet, it really incorporates a lot of it. I mean, if you think about it, all of these kinds of things, they depend on money. They depend on income. And as your income goes up, you can afford more of the things that enhance that quality of life. And I give the same response to those who make the third criticism, which is that GDP does not measure environmental quality. So it's not telling us how clean our air is and how beautiful the skies are, the forests, the water. And that's true. GDP does not directly measure those things, but at the same time, societies with higher income, they naturally want cleaner environments, and they desire those things as well, and they tend to move in lockstep with each other. So most economists use GDP as the measure of prosperity. And I'm one of those mainstream economists that think it's a great measure of prosperity. So there's these alternative measures out there, things like green GDP that corrects the GDP measure to try to add in environmental quality. I'm not a big fan of some of these corrected GDP measures, potentially valuable, but not being widely used. And I don't see any big benefit in moving that direction. There's a number 2 on this list is direct measures of happiness. For an example is gross national happiness. This is when you actually just go out and you start asking survey questions where you say, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 3? 3 is I'm very happy, 2 is I'm somewhat happy, and 1 is I'm not very happy. And they do these surveys, in all these 150 different countries, and then they average them up and they say, look, people in Denmark are much happier than people in the United States or people in Brazil or wherever. And they do these cross-country comparisons. And it turns out that this stuff is really suspect. I mean, there may be some advances here in the future that make this believable, but as of now, it just, I'll give you an example. There was this fun study done where some economists went around and asked people in the US how tall they were. So they measured them and got their actual height, and then they asked them, how tall are you? Are you very tall, somewhat tall, or not very tall? And then they tried to do some comparisons. So who's taller, men or women? Well, if you measure them, men are taller on average. But if you go by the survey responses, women were much taller on average because there were way more women answering, oh, I'm very tall. And yet they were shorter than the average man still. And so it's difficult to know what to make of these national happiness measures where they're just asking, how happy are you? Because I don't know how to compare that to anything else. Whereas with money, with GDP, I know exactly how to compare that. I know how to compare that across countries, and I know how to compare that over time. A third way to do this is doing these capability measures where you're augmenting the GDP measure with something else. Like in HDI, this Human Development Index that's championed by by international, these global organizations. There you're adding in literacy, you're adding in life expectancy and some other measures of quality of life, and then just imposing some arbitrary weights and then adding them up. And so these kind of measures are saying, well, here's some other things we also care about, let's weight them and throw them together. Again, it's maybe potentially useful, but I don't know that this is so much better than just having the GDP number on its own. A final approach is like in Australia where they have this whole dashboard of indicators where they'll have like 30 different indicators all being presented by the statistical agency all at once and saying, these are all the things that are important, which include all sorts of stuff like, sea temperature and mining activity and just a whole bunch of other stuff up there. And it just becomes this wash of information that you're not sure what to do with. I think that's why people focus so strongly on GDP. Now, moving on to sustainability. Sustainability is a very different question than prosperity. So from my point of view, I think economists do a pretty good job of measuring prosperity. We know all about consumption and all about income, and so we're doing a fairly good job of measuring today's prosperity. Sustainability is all about something going on in the future. And there we're doing a much worse job. So first of all, to make it clear, what is it that we're trying to sustain? From my point of view, what we're trying to sustain is human well-being. I'm not trying to sustain like the Earth exactly the way the Earth is and trying to maintain everything as if it was, we never advanced in any way. No, I'm trying to, what I want to sustain is having people be at least as happy in the future as they are today. So increasing current well-being, GDP going up, does not necessarily imply sustainability. I mean, it's very possible to say we've got a lot of past income growth, but that does not necessarily mean that in the future our children and future generations are going to be as happy as we are. And so from my point of view, sustainability means that consumption growth, or that GDP is going to be at least as high in the future as it is today. All right, so I'll give you a quick example. And I was at a UN meeting and I met the ambassador from Trinidad and Tobago, and he was telling me about, I was presenting on this topic, and so he was telling me about his country's experience. And so I thought I'd share his point of view with you, which is that in Trinidad and Tobago, these are two small islands. Well, one's much larger than the other. Everybody lives in Trinidad, and there's a few people that live in Tobago out of their 1.2 million population. It's right off the coast of South America. Very high annual GDP growth rate up until the financial crisis, where it slowed down quite a bit. But the growth rate was really astronomical for a big period of time. And I'll show you the chart on the next slide. Really high level of business integration, international business, well regulated, a very stable financial system. And the other thing about Trinidad and Tobago is that in 2011, the international organizations declared them to be a developed country. They moved into OECD developed country status, and they moved into high income economy status from the World Bank. And so basically they're saying they've arrived. And the reason they're saying these things is because when you look at the GDP per capita, there was this big growth in GDP per capita compared to the world average. And so when you see that kind of massive growth, and you think, yeah, this is a country that's arrived. But the worry here is that 50%, in fact, it was more than 50%, it's fallen down to 50% of their GDP is all from extraction. It's all oil, minerals, natural gas extraction. And this is not a country with high reserves of these things. So, for example, they have only 0.2% of the world's natural gas reserves, and yet they've made up recently 1.3% of the world's natural gas production. So they're producing at a much higher rate, say, than that they have reserves for. And this means that they are going to run out. I mean, their supply is going to be much more expensive to get to, and at some point it won't be economically feasible to keep extracting at this rate. And you can see that they're not investing in their people. So, look at expected years of schooling in Trinidad and Tobago. It's far below just the Latin American and Caribbean average, which those countries have much lower GDP on average. So if you look at the gross national income here, a closely related income measure, income is only $14,000 per capita, whereas in Trinidad and Tobago we're over $26,000 per capita. So, for much more income, lower life expectancy, lower years of schooling, it just doesn't seem as though they're investing as much. And you can see this in the infrastructure in the country. It's not being invested in the country. It doesn't bode well for sustainability. So what I'm going to do is write down a formal model, and this is just the sketch of the formal model of what it means to be sustainable. And then I'm going to have a measure of sustainability that I'm going to compute for all of these, for a whole bunch of different countries, and I'll show you a few of the numbers. And I'm proposing that this kind of a number that measures sustainability be presented alongside GDP. So into the model, unless there's any questions at this point. The model is that consumption, C, is, all goods and services, and you could define it even more comprehensively than GDP if you'd like. I mean, it could be, even environmental goods and services if you want, government provided, and that's what utility is made up of. Prosperity is a function of all of those consumption goods that are out there, the services and the goods. Now, when we measure this, it depends on prices. I'll call them shadow prices because not every good and service is in the market, and so we have just a market price. Sometimes, instead of using the market price alone, we'll use like a society value kind of price. And so we'll call all of them just shadow prices. P is the vector of those prices. And then the production in society depends on K, which is a vector of capital goods. Okay, so this is the last page of the formal model. There's a really influential paper by Dasgupta and Mahler. So Dasgupta and Mahler in 2000, they define a concept known as intergenerational well-being, which just says that all you do is you take those utility flows, the prosperity in every time period, and you discount them and add them up. So I've got utility in period T, and then in period T plus 1, and in period T plus 2. I discount them and I add them all up, and that concept will be intergenerational well-being. And in 2001, Partha Dasgupta showed that potential intergenerational well-being does not decline if and only if a comprehensive measure of that country's wealth does not decline. So it's basically saying that the concept of sustainability is all about wealth. If wealth goes down, you're hurting your potential to produce in the future and to have future generations be as well off as they are today. If wealth is going up, it gives you that potential to produce more in the future and to have people be better off than they are today. So there's no assumptions in any of this about optimality, about being on some sort of an optimal growth path or anything else like that. This is just, I want to measure wealth. Not just financial wealth, though. I want to measure the productive base, the kind of wealth that produces stuff. So financial wealth is going to be involved in that, of course, but so is every other kind of wealth, every other kind of capital stock that's out there. That's part of this productive base. So in some papers where I'm a co-author, this is the Arrow and All 2012 paper, or the Inclusive Wealth Report. There's been a couple of these that have come out, one in 2012, one in 2014, and our next issue is not coming out till 2017 of this UN publication of the Inclusive Wealth Report. But in these, we're defining this concept of national wealth to be simply you measure all the capital stocks, you multiply each capital stock by its price, its shadow or society value, you add them all up, and then that's the wealth in that particular country. Or you can do this at a sub-country level too. You can do it state by state. I've done that in a paper from a few years ago. You can do this even more locally if you want, as long as you've got measures of capital at that level of society. And then, again, to recap, the sustainability just simply means wealth is not declining. If you want future productivity to be high and future well-being to be high, you need the wealth to support that. So, final example. This example is sort of an investment example. This is about Warren Buffett. So, imagine that Warren Buffett is trying to evaluate a company that he's planning to buy, or he's thinking about buying. And so he wants to know, how healthy is this company? What are its future profits going to look like? Now, you can't just know that. You've got to go and look at the reports and see, what does it seem like it's going to be like. Well, imagine that he only has access to the income statements. So he can only see what revenue's been like, what expenditure has been like, but he has no idea what's going on the balance sheet. He doesn't know what the asset position of this country is, or this company is. He doesn't know if they have large inventories. He doesn't know what kind of factories and production facilities they own. All he sees is income, the revenue stream, and he sees the expenses, and that's it. If that's all you're seeing, how do you distinguish companies that have similar income and similar expenditure? I mean, if that's all you're seeing, you could mistakenly think that a company that's had really high revenue growth is a good bet, when in fact all they've been doing is selling off all their inventory, and at the point you buy them, there's no inventory left, and their revenue is going to drop like crazy. That compared to, say, a company that has been having lower net income after you take the revenue and minus out the expenses, maybe that company's been investing heavily in new production facilities, and they're just about to go online and start being very, very profitable. You won't know this stuff if you don't have the balance sheet. And that's the situation we're in when it comes to looking and comparing the economies of countries. We don't have balance sheets. We don't know what sort of asset position these countries are in. We are only looking at the income statements. So, when it comes to measuring national wealth, there's three main types of capital that I'm concerned about, and the first is I'm going to call reproducible capital. This is all the physical capital stock. It's like the machines and the buildings and the infrastructure, the roads, the ports, all of that stuff, and that's going to include then all the financial wealth, because when you think about what it is to own a portfolio of stock in various companies, I mean you're owning their physical assets. You're owning that capital stock, plus other things like some intellectual capital and other things like that. That's all included there in this manufactured, reproducible capital. And we actually do a fairly good job in national income accounting of capturing most of the elements of this. I mean, there's some exceptions, of course, but across the board, national income accounting in many countries is doing a good job of measuring reproducible capital. But this is only one component of the productive base. The other two major ones are natural capital, which includes forests and minerals and energy goods like oil and natural gas and so on. And then also human capital, which is very important, right? This is the productive capacity of all the people in that country. Now, it's going to be tough to measure that, but this was where I got involved in this project as a labor economist, was trying to get into this and say, how do you measure human capital for a country? How do you say how much productive capacity a country has from its people? And education is a big key part of that, but it's certainly not the only part. There's other things like global public goods. So one of them is, for example, if you're very concerned about global warming and climate change types of issues, and you believe these scientific reports that are showing, what the cost of an additional ton of carbon is in the atmosphere and so on. You can incorporate these kinds of things into this framework easily. And one thing to note here is that it really doesn't matter how much you pollute. That doesn't affect your wealth. What matters is how much of the concentration is in the atmosphere. That's why it's a global public bad or global public goods. Those exist as well. So you can easily add these into the framework. For now, I'm just going to focus on these main three. The shadow prices are a real sticky area, because with shadow prices, for a lot of things like reproducible capital, for many of them you've got market prices because these things are traded, they're sold. But for some types, it's really difficult to know what it's worth. And one of the conventions in national income accounting is just to use, rather than use like the trying to go out and value something, they just say, well, how much did it cost to make it? And maybe it's worth that much, or they depreciate it over time after that. And so there's these shorthands, but really what it's about is about what is it worth to society in terms of its productive capacity. And so there are going to be things like, how do you value a forest? How do you value a fishery, or things that don't exactly have good market prices. I mean, you've got a market for timber, you've got a market for fish, but the forest provides so much more than just timber, right? It's providing all sorts of other services, including its beauty and cleaning the water and providing habitat for animals and a lot of other things. So you've got to go to these forestry experts and try to come up with social values of what's that forest worth. This is going to be a sticking point on any sort of effort like this, because people are going to say, well, I don't necessarily agree with those shadow prices, but I'm great with that. I think that's the kind of debate we want to be having in society, is how much are these various types of capital, what are they worth? Okay, so winding down here, and then I'm going to show you some data. I'll just give you a quick picture of the literature on this. There's two main streams of literature. One is that there's some early work by the World Bank, and particularly by Hamilton, showing that you can measure all of this stuff easily if you assume that every country is on an optimal growth path. And the group that I'm mostly involved with has been showing that you can still measure this stuff with added assumptions about shadow prices, even if you don't assume that we're on an optimal growth path. And I like, of course, my approach much better, and the reason is that I don't believe countries are on optimal growth paths. I think that we make mistakes all the time. I don't think anyone would argue that Venezuela is on an optimal growth path, right? Countries do things and make poor decisions and don't optimally invest, and that shouldn't affect the way that we measure wealth. I think that we should just measure it independently of those kinds of modeling assumptions. And there's a whole lot of criticism and defense, and so I put that up on the slide there for you to see. If you want to look up any of these papers that are, either attacking this methodology or providing defense for this methodology, but it's very much a debate. And in fact, the debate I think is fun. It reminds me of the debate I've read about from the 1930s when GDP was being developed. And there was a very strong debate about whether or not you could just add all these different kinds of goods and services together into one number. and what we would do about all of the various sticking points, all of the things that were seeming to be exceptions to the rules. How do you handle all that? I mean, that's very much the stage we're in right now for this national wealth accounting. So here's some graphs or some charts that will show what we've calculated for changes in this comprehensive measure of national wealth. Here calling it inclusive wealth because it comes from that inclusive wealth report I'm a part of. So for the United States, you can see over time I'm showing the change in the various measures. This isn't the wealth stock. This is the change in the wealth stock to show that sustainable path. So I've got in 1990, I've got what is the produced or reproducible capital stock, and then I've got it in 1995, and then this is the change in that first column from 1990 to 1995. In the first row for produced capital, $7,240 per capita increased produced capital. And so as you go down, you see that in the United States, we're producing more stuff. We've got a better infrastructure. The natural capital in each of these years is declining, and that's because we're extracting minerals and resources to do this. And then human capital in the United States is in general increasing, and that in fact increasing at such a rate that that's where a big chunk of the growth is coming from, although most of it's from the produced and the reproducible kind of capital. And you can see that overall we would say that the United States is in a good sustainable position, and that is that its wealth is increasing in each of these time periods, suggesting that productivity and prosperity will continue to increase in the future. The same is true for the United Kingdom, and you'll see that just as a comparison, their natural capital extraction is much, much less than in the United States. They just have less natural capital to extract. And yet the inclusive wealth is growing still at a very similar rate, suggesting this future prosperity. In Australia, natural capital is the opposite. I mean, they're extracting at a very high rate with really lots and lots of mining activity. But that mining activity is being offset by huge investments in infrastructure and even larger investments there in human capital as compared to some of the other countries. Here, the last one, I guess I've got one slide after this with more numbers, but I've got Japan listed. You can see Japan's numbers of almost no natural capital extraction whatsoever, but also not very large human capital investment recently. Compare this to the experience. Well, we'll look at China and then Venezuela. So in China, the growth is really, it's almost all about this reproducible capital. The productive base is growing primarily through that kind of investment, and the human capital growth has not been nearly as large. In fact, you'd say that most of China's wealth the change in the wealth is all coming from the produced capital. Well, in Venezuela, I picked this as an example just because the extraction of natural capital is very large, and this is mostly oil, of course. But you can see that at the same time they're extracting all this oil, they're not investing very much. I mean, there's a little bit of gain in human capital, a little bit of increase in education. In some years, there's some gain in produced capital, but not much, and certainly not consistently. And you look at this and you say, wow, inclusive wealth is dropping in every time period, meaning that this country is in worse and worse shape and is not on a sustainable path. But if you just look at their GDP, which is that last slide, this is the change in GDP year on year, it doesn't look nearly as bad. I mean, it doesn't look good, but you look across from 2000 to 2010, and there's increases in per capita real GDP. And so, when you're in that kind of a situation, you think, this is a situation where GDP looks like it's still going up, and yet wealth is dropping dramatically. And for me, focusing on that comparison, that's what's valuable. So I'll conclude here just with a few lessons from what I've learned so far in this research, which is just, some of this is a little bit technical, and then I'll share some thoughts at the end. One of them is that when you're measuring things like oil or natural gas or something, you never want to use these historical series of proven reserves, and that is because proven reserves just seem to go up and up and up over time as we discover new stockpiles of this stuff. And so what you need to do is you need extraction data. You need to see how much people are extracting as you produce this stuff. So rather than go back and say, well, how much oil was there in the ground in 2000 and how much oil is there in the ground in 2010, well, we've discovered new reserves and we've discovered new techniques for extracting it, and that increases the amount that's in the, that increases the amount that's economically recoverable, even if it doesn't actually increase the amount that's in the ground. And so you work backwards when you do this. I think I already talked about carbon emissions. Another thing is that you've got to be careful about who owns the capital. So reproducible capital in the United States could be owned by somebody in China, and they have the claim on the future production of that capital asset. So dealing with ownership claims, as long as those are being respected, that's important. You need to say who owns the capital, not just where it's physically located. All of this has been ignoring distributional considerations. Just like there's no inequality in GDP, so far there's no inequality in these wealth measures. But just like in GDP, you can do Gini coefficients. You can do them here for wealth as well. But you end up with an interesting issue, which is, how do you deal with these commonly owned resources like a forest? If we all own the forest, because it's like a national park or something, like who do you assign that wealth to? And so you have to split it up and figure out how to distribute it. And so there's those kind of tricky issues here when you're trying to do Gini coefficients and inequality measures. I think that the change in the value of wealth is much better than a percentage change, because there's a lot of missing assets and you end up with a base value problem. And so, rather than throwing in some, you could say, well, part of my wealth is the value of the sun being there. Without the sun, we wouldn't have light and so on. Well, you throw that in, and the sun's so valuable, it just creates this base value problem. So I like putting everything in terms of the actual dollar changes and ignoring the base. Finally, subnational wealth accounting is very useful. Subnational wealth accounting, where you're looking at, say, instead of a national wealth number, but say the per capita wealth of a particular state or a particular region inside of a country or a particular, say, ethnic group inside of a country. These things can be really helpful and maybe a good way at getting at the inequality idea if we've got ethnic or racial or geographic inequality, and that's what we're concerned about. Okay, so final thought on this is just there's a lot of countries out there that are really focused on GDP. And I think the United States is actually not one of those that's very strongly focused on GDP. We often are very focused on the unemployment rate and so on. But some countries, GDP growth, that is the measure that the government cares about. It's the measure that keeps that particular government in power. For example, I was in Malaysia not too long ago and met with their finance minister. And they expressed the concern that if GDP growth were to ever fall below a particular magic number they picked, that the government would collapse and they would have to come up with a new coalition and have a new prime minister, because they lose confidence in their government if GDP growth ever falls below a certain, magic level. And that leads to some very short-sighted decisions. Some of those in Malaysia were chopping down all of the forest and then planting these palm oil plantations, which caused a lot of damage, not just environmental damage, but they had these big mudslides, and they ended up having all sorts of other kinds of issues that came from these decisions. But they were needing GDP growth right then, and a palm plantation provides GDP growth, and just preserving a forest does not. On the other hand, wealth measurement, that would take that into account, right? When you extract a valuable natural resource, that's a hit against your wealth. You've used that up. When you extract your oil, that means that you've now used that up, and that if you're not investing in something else that's productive and valuable, that's going to be a hurt in that situation. And so if we had both numbers up there, not just GDP that they're focused on, but if you were measuring wealth at the same time, it gives the citizens of a country something to look at and to say, how is our government doing? Yeah, our GDP growth is going up, but look at our wealth number. It's going down, and that means that I'm concerned about the future. And that's what I want to be using this for. I want it to be to help inform people about what's going on in their country. Right now, I feel like with only GDP really being promoted and pushed out there, that we're not getting a complete picture, and we need more. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to turn the time over to Jennifer, who's here to tell you a little bit about Purdue, and then I'll be back to take questions at the end if there's any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kevin. There we go. I sure learned a lot. I'd like to take just a few moments as you're thinking of questions to talk about Purdue's executive education programs. So first of all, thank you for joining our webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. And then we have two programs. We have our executive MBA program, which starts in every September. And then we have our global MBA program, executive MBA program, that launches in every March. Both of them are 19 months from the start to finish. And there is an orientation at Purdue that's about a week long. After that, you'll have a pre-residency of 8 to 10 weeks, and you'll do online prep where you'll do faculty videos, you'll do some learning, all in preparation for the residency, where you are either on campus, or if you're on the global, then you're on a different country on campus. And you'll have classes, company visits, you'll have guest speakers, we have career management to help you, there's social events, networking. After that, you'll have an exam prep period of 1 week, where you'll prepare for all of your exams. And then you do have an exam period of 9 days. They're all online. They start on Saturday, and then they continue to the following Sunday. Some of the exams are timed, but you don't have to do all of them at the same time. As long as you do the timed ones and get those out of the way, then you don't have to continue to the next one. You can take a break, and as long as you get them done within that 9-day period. And then after the exams, you'll have a 1 week break where you can just relax and catch up with family. And then the new residency starts with the new study groups. And then for both of them, you do have a minimum of 5 years work experience, and our cohorts usually have an average of 13 to 16 years of work experience. It is a blending learning that I did mention, that it's online and then you're on campus. And it's a general management MBA, and 40% of the faculty do teach in both programs. You network with professionals from around the U.S. and beyond, because you do go international. And we do have a capstone project and a cohort-based electives, which means for the executive MBA, the cohort as a group chooses electives of about 3 to 4, and then they'll choose which ones they want to do. And then, as mentioned, we do have a career management support as well. And then for our fall MBA, there's 5 residencies, and they're all in West Lafayette. They're 1 to 2 weeks each, depending on the module. And then the 6th one is a 2-week residency abroad. And as mentioned, you do the immersion electives, where you do design your own curriculum choices. And then for our global EMBA, there's 5 residencies, and they're all 2 weeks each, but they're in 7 different countries. So they're 2 weeks just because we don't want to, you can't get the culture in just a week. So then there is that significant culture and business immersion during all the residencies. And the good thing about this is you earn 2 MBA degrees. You earn 1 from Purdue, and then you do earn 1 from the European partner. So thank you for joining us, and if you would like to learn more about the EMBA and Global IMM programs, you can visit us online at krannert.purdue.edu/executive. We have our brochure. You can view alumni testimonials and much more. And if you are ready to start your executive education journey, the Executive MBA class of 2017 does launch September 12th of 2016. Please contact us if you would like to be considered for application. And the IMM Global Executive MBA class of 2018 launches on March 19th of 2017 at Purdue. The application deadline is January 18th, so there's still time. If you have any questions, feel free to contact our admissions director, Nancy Schmiegel, or our executive director, Aldous Kuchunis. I will now turn this back over to Kevin. Thank you.
Okay, great. Greg,
Alright.
Do you have any questions, or should we sign off?
We do have some questions. Would you also mind returning to our previous slide on the slide deck for us while we get the first
Oh,
question?
yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So, the first question we have is,
Okay.
could you revisit green GDP and its significance?
Yeah, sure. Green GDP, essentially it's just a GDP number, and then you subtract for environmental damage being done. So it's like a way of saying, well, your GDP is $52,000 per capita, but you also have a bad environment in this measured way, and so we're going to subtract from GDP some of these environmental damages. And it's a little bit ad hoc in that sense, but on the other hand, like if you thought about, instead of just subtracting off some ad hoc adjustments for that, what if you were thinking about the services that the environment was providing you with? I mean, you could, in a sense, add that into your income if you'd like, and that might be a more comprehensive measure of income. So it's not that I'm opposed to that. It's just that it doesn't really address the issue of sustainability. I mean, green GDP just is another income measure. It's not a wealth measure. So it's telling you what's happening today, but not necessarily telling you what's going to happen in the future.
Thank you. I have a question here. What is the difference between GDP and GNI? One country with its current GDP can be considered as developing country, but with the GNI, the same country is ranked as at least a developing country. Why such a difference, and how exactly does the GDP and GNI affect the country ranking?
Yeah, great question. So GNI is the gross national income, and so this is gross national income is going to be all of the people who are citizens of that country. So that's the national part. It's their incomes all added up. Not going to be exactly the same as gross domestic product, because gross domestic product is computed primarily from all of the production going on within that country's borders. And so there's going to be some differences if you have a population that doesn't live all inside of your country, or if people in your country own a lot of production facilities in other countries. Those two numbers could be different from each other. And in terms of the rankings of these things, I mean, they're good for international comparisons. The World Bank or the UN or whoever declaring that one country is developed and another country is not, those kinds of distinctions don't mean a lot to me. I mean, my example with Trinidad and Tobago was that, I mean, they've declared them a developed country and so on, but that's not so meaningful. I mean, to me, what's meaningful about the future is how wealthy are the people in that country, where wealth doesn't just mean financial wealth, right? Where wealth means human capital and the environment and everything. And so, GDP, GNI, they're very similar measures, and all of these kinds of developed country cutoff points, I don't know that matters a lot to me.
Alright, thank you. Next question we have is, what do you think about taking wealth as the ability to produce instead of a stock measure?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's what wealth is supposed to be. Well, my version of national wealth here is supposed to be a stock measure, right? And so maybe the question is, why are you multiplying it by its price? Why not just go with the stocks themselves? Like, well, you have this much oil in the ground, and you have this many acres of forest, and you've got this many people with this level of productivity. You could just have all these stock measures, and that's kind of the approach they're using in Australia right now, which is just show all the stock measures, just show all the data, and put it up there with crime and literacy and everything else. Well, I mean, the problem with that is that nobody's going to pay attention to that, right? And what we need is, you need something that's equivalent, similar to GDP, in that it's an aggregate measure of all of the productive capability, rather than GDP, which is just the current production. You want something that is, comprehensive in that way. And so I take all those stock measures, I multiply them by their shadow prices, and add them all up. Once you've aggregated it, you have a single number that measures how wealthy is that country.
Thank you. I have a question now here from Alex who asks, how does oil reserves accounting differ from countries versus companies? I believe oil and gas companies do account for these in their balance sheets.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's a good place to get this data. BP provides it not just by their own company, but they provide like a world country by country list of what the proven or the economically recoverable reserves are country by country. And so, the point I'd made earlier about it depends on who owns the reserves, that does get a little bit tricky here, because just because that oil reserve is within a particular country's borders does not necessarily mean that people in that country own that reserve. The rights may have been sold off to some foreign entity, and then in a sense, it's as if those reserves are owned by some other country or some group of countries that own that. And so you've got to be careful in the way you account for these things. I agree. But the theory is clear, even if the data practice here is difficult. I mean, the theory is whoever owns that resource, if they're leaving it in the ground and not extracting it, that's still wealth that they have access to in the future. And once you extract it, that's reducing the amount of wealth you have access to in the future.
All right, great. Well, Professor Mumford, thank you so much for addressing the questions from the audience. I want to also thank everybody who joined us today for this presentation, and again, thank you to Purdue and the Krannert School of Management. Before we sign off, do you have any final thoughts to leave the audience with?
Oh, I enjoyed doing this. Thanks so much. And I've really been happy to have been involved in this development of national wealth accounting for the past 10 years or so. It's something that we're making some progress on. I don't want to make it sound as though nobody's doing this. So I spent the last 7 months in England, and the United Kingdom has agreed to start producing these wealth measures. And so the National Statistical Agency has not yet, but will be producing national wealth measures very similar to the kinds I'm proposing here. The government of India has done the same thing. I don't think they're as far along, but so far the United States has not made any efforts to do this, and we haven't gotten a lot of excitement here about it. That said, I mean, this is the kind of thing that citizens need. And citizens need the ability to evaluate their government on the kind of long-run choices they're making, not just short-run choices that affect, prosperity today. I care a lot about what's going to happen in the future, and I think that we all do. We all want to evaluate our countries, our governments this way, and we need the statistical measurement to be able to do it. And so that's where this kind of thing comes in. All right, well, thanks so much.